Lord be with you. Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth nations will be in dismay, perplexed by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will die of fright in anticipation of what is coming upon the world, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these signs begin to happen, stand erect and raise your heads, because your redemption is at hand." He told them a parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Beware that your hearts do not become drowsy, for that day will assault everybody who lives on the face of the earth. Be vigilant at all times." The gospel inspired by God. All over the world, in hundreds of different cultures, there are stories about an extraordinary cataclysm, a flood that destroyed the planet. You find it in all Native American Indian traditions. You find it in Meso and South America. I found it in Africa. We find it in the Celtic lore. You find it in the Middle East, in the Sumerians. You find it in Asia. You find it among the Aboriginals of Australia. All over the world, hundreds and hundreds of versions of some kind of a cataclysmic flood that destroyed the planet. Now there is geological evidence supporting that. Very, very recent geological evidence showing that 12,800 years ago there was an extraordinary cataclysm. Now I go back a little bit before that. The glacial maximum, when the ice was at its thickest during the last ice age, was about 21,000 years ago. And then it began to melt slowly, and for the next 8,000 years it's melting. And then in the year 12,800 years ago, there was this extraordinary cataclysm. A comet intersected with the trajectory of planet Earth, broke up into little pieces about 1 kilometer wide, and impacted, hitting the ice cap in the North American continent and creating worldwide devastation. So hot that it melted the ice cap all of a sudden, and these vast quantities of liquid ice poured into the Atlantic and into the Pacifics, deluging the world. And we found nano diamonds all over the world indicating what that impact was. It threw up so much moisture and so much debris that for a few hundred years afterwards, the sun literally was darkened, and we went right back into the ice age. The ice age, which had been working its way downwards, reversed itself and started going backwards. And this is called, in geological terms, the Younger Dryas era. So there's evidence for such a cataclysmic event. And you find it, as I say, in all great cultures. And you certainly find it in the Hebrew scriptures, in the story of Noah, and you find it in the Sumerian from which it came, and you find it today mentioned in this interesting pseudo-epigraphical literature called the Testament of Adam. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. Firstly, I'll talk about this Testament of Adam that you just heard read, that Alfred just read for us. And then I'm going to talk about the function and the history of prophecy. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the end times. And then fourthly, coming awake and staying awake. So there'll be the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, the Testament of Adam. This is a document which purports to be written by the son of Adam, a guy called Seth. Adam had 3 sons initially, 2 sons, Cain and Abel, and they got into a row, and Cain killed Abel, and then his 3rd son was Seth, and so the descent is from Seth. And this allegedly is a conversation that Adam is having with his son Seth before he dies. And he's reporting on a conversation that he, Adam, had with God. And so it appears to be written way, way, way back. Adam lived for 930 years, and his son Seth lived for 912 years. And then much later, you have a flood. So in this document, it prophesies two events. It prophesies the great flood, and it prophesies the coming of the Messiah. Now the problem, of course, is that this is one of those kinds of pieces of literature that I've called retroactive prognostication. This document, the earliest manuscript of it is found in the 6th century, and the original goes back to the 4th century AD. So the document is actually written thousands of years after the events they're purporting to predict. So it's very easy to be accurate when you have the history, the benefit of hindsight to make your prophecies come true. But as the story unfolds this morning, if you were listening carefully to it, it is allegedly a conversation between Adam and his son Seth. And Adam is reporting to his son Seth a conversation that he and God had before God kicked him out of the Garden of Eden. And according to this, he predicted that there was going to be this great deluge many years hence. And then he also predicted the coming of the Messiah with such extraordinary detail. He said, God is talking to Adam now, and he says, I myself will become a human being. And I will be born of a virgin called Mary in the town of Bethlehem in Judea. And I will become a wonder worker. I'll walk on water. I'll calm the waves and the wind. I'll cure the lepers and give sight to the blind, and the deaf will hear. I will be killed, and I will be in the grave for 3 days, and then I will raise up again. And so God is making these extraordinary predictions about what's going to happen thousands of years down the road. And then Seth says, and then my father, when he was finished telling me this, he died, and we buried him in a cave, and we put him with him some of the loot that he had taken from paradise with him. On his way out, he grabbed a bunch of gold and frankincense and myrrh and stuck it under his oxter and ran off with it while God wasn't looking. And Seth says, and we buried him with the gold and the frankincense in the myrrh. And my prediction is, as I see into the future, that somewhere in several thousand years' time, wise men are going to come from the east, and they're going to find the cave where Adam is buried, and they'll find the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh, and they'll schlep it all the way to Bethlehem, and they're going to give it to this little baby who was born. And what an amazing piece of prophecy. Amazing. That's my first point. Second point now is the function of prophecy and its history. Imagine now you're part of an early Christian congregation in the 6th or 7th century. And some dude dressed up like this is preaching to you, and he has a text and he says, here's the prediction, here was a conversation between our father Adam and his son Seth, in which he predicted that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem of a virgin called Mary. He would be a wonder worker, and wise men would come from the east, and they would give him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And if you're a 6th century AD audience, you're going, oh my God, wow, this is definitely the Word of God. How could something thousands of years before the event have had such exquisite detail and prophecy with such accuracy what was going to happen? And we'd be sitting in our pews or wherever we were sitting just in awe of this kind of literature. And the problem, of course, is it was written, thousands of years after the events it was describing. So I call it just this kind of retroactive prognostication. So what then is the function of prophecy? Prophecy is not about predicting the future. That is not the function of prophecy. Prophecy is not about predicting the future. It's about preventing the future. Very, very big difference. Not to predict it, it is to prevent it. Because the prophet is the one who can see clearly what is. Not what's going to happen, but what is. And if you see clearly what's happening and what is, you see the trajectory. It's obvious then where it's headed. So I remember sharing with you one time a television program I saw when I was a small kid in Ireland, and television had just come to Ireland in the 1960s. And there was a program called Telefís Scoile, or school television, where they would take some of the best teachers in the country demonstrating how to teach a particular topic. And I remember watching this physics teacher teaching a group of about 8 or 9-year-old kids. And he brings the kids into the laboratory, and there's a very simple kind of apparatus set up. There was a little glass beaker, 3/4 filled with water, and there's a pencil inside in the water. And the teacher stands in front of the glass and he says, what do you see? And they're going, sir. Okay, Jojo, what do you see? I see a glass beaker full of water, and there's a pencil stuck in it, and the pencil is bent. And he pulls the pencil out, and of course the pencil isn't bent. He says, no, I'm going to teach you the law of refraction. Air and water refract light very, very differently. So the pencil isn't actually bent. It only appears to be bent where the water and the air are meeting. And they'll say, wow, great. So he sends him out of the laboratory and brings him back in 10 minutes later, and there's the same apparatus set up. And he says, what do you see? And, sir. Kathleen, what do you see? And Kathleen says, I see a beaker full of water, and there's a pencil stuck in it, and it appears to be bent, but it's not really bent. That's the refraction of air and water are different, so it's not really bent. And the teacher pulls out the pencil, and the pencil is bent. He has broken the pencil in the interim. No, he was playing a trick on them, obviously. But I've never forgotten that. And what it said to me immediately was that most of us see what appears to be. And then secondly, we see what we're told is there, or what we expect to see. But very few people see actually what is. And that's the difference between the prophet and the rest of us. The prophet is not so much the person who can predict the future. The prophet is the person who sees the present really, really, really clearly. And if you see the present really clearly, the law of karma suggests to you, if you keep doing A, B will keep happening. If you want to stop B happening, stop doing A. And so the prophet is the person who sees clearly what is. And on the basis of that can say, guys, you keep going like this, such and such a thing is going to happen. But it is not the basic function of prophecy to predict the future. That was actually introduced by Jeremiah 600 BC when he was in a dispute with the false prophets. And he established this criterion that the false prophets will not be able to predict the future, whereas the real prophets will be. But that was an afterthought. The real function of prophecy was to call people back into the covenant with God. So we prevent the future by looking at our actions and seeing where they're headed, and then going back into alignment with God. So the real function of the prophet is to call us back into alignment with God, either with the covenant or with our own sense of personal mission or with a global raising of Christ consciousness on the planet. So that's the function of prophecy. But prophecy has gone through many, many, many different phases throughout human history, beginning with Judaism. So within Judaism, there are 3 eras to prophecy. So to give you kind of the historical context, the Israelites escaped out of Egypt in the year 1250 BC. And they spent 40 years wandering in the desert. And then they enter the promised land in the year 1210 BC. But there are people there. So it takes them 200 years to conquer the whole land. In fact, it's only in the year 1010 BC that David finally conquers the city of Jerusalem, which was a much, much older city. So it takes him 200 years to conquer the land. Now, during this period of conquest, the first group of prophets arise. And they're called the Guild of the Prophets. They weren't individual people talking and making predictions. They were operating as a group. And they were very, very probably influenced by some kind of magic mushrooms. And I'm not joking with you. They were ingesting a substance called soma. And on the basis of that, they were having mystical experiences as a group, and they were making all of these kinds of pronouncements as a result. So that was the first group. They flourished beginning about 1100 BC. And it went on for several hundred years. The second wave of prophecy were the individual non-writing prophets of Israel. People like Nathan or Elijah or Elisha. And they operated as individuals, and their shtick was they were inveighing against individual acts of injustice on the part of leaders, particularly kings. So they would oppose kings for their acts of injustice. So the prophet Nathan took David to task because he had killed a man and stolen his wife, even though David himself had hundreds of wives of his own. But he had killed another man and stolen his wife. And Nathan opposes him with this act. Or the prophet Elijah opposes the king of his time, a king called Ahab. And so the second wave of prophets are individuals who are opposing individual acts of injustice perpetrated by leaders of some kind or other. And that goes on for a few hundred years. All these are overlapping, obviously. And the third great wave within Judaism is the era of the great writing prophets, those who have left literature behind them. People like Isaiah, who flourished about 740 BC, or Jeremiah, who flourished about 600 BC, or Ezekiel, who flourished about 550 BC. So these left great tomes after them. And rather than inveighing against individual acts of injustice on the part of leaders, they were inveighing against institutionalized injustice. So that had built itself right into the very fabric of society, the economic model or the political system. They were inveighing against this. So this is the great history of prophecy of the prophets within Judaism. coming right down to our own times, and we've got our own version of prophets in our own times, and we do with them what every culture has done with its prophets. We kill them. We kill our own prophets in this country. In the 1960s was the age of killing our prophets. We killed the Kennedy brothers, and then we killed Martin Luther King, and then we visited our agenda. We killed Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, a democratically elected leader, and then we killed several leaders in Meso and South America. So we've continued to kill the prophets. And in our own times, the prophets, we might call them whistleblowers, and they're being treated in exactly the same fashion. Those who call society's leaders to task for the institutionalized injustice that we find around us. This is the function of prophecy. And the prophet is always countercultural. The great institutions never produce prophets. Religion does not produce prophets. Politics does not produce prophets. Economic models do not produce prophets. Military industrial complexes do not produce prophets. The prophets come from outside the system and they challenge these, and they're typically killed. Mostly there's only two kinds of prophets that we admire. We admire the dead ones. We'll give them a day. We'll call Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We'll give them a day all to their own, and we'll create memorials to them. Or we love prophets who are doing their shtick someplace else. Some prophet who's challenging communism. We admire these guys. Gorbachev, we would admire a Gorbachev. But let anybody challenge our system, the way we do stuff, and we'll kill them. So that's the history of prophecy. That's my second point. My third point then is the end times. This lugubrious passage that I just read from the Gospel of Luke here, where Jesus is talking about the end times. And he's talking about signs in the heavens, and the stars, and the sun, and the moon, and catastrophes on earth, and wars of various kinds. And he makes allegedly these kinds of predictions. He says to his audience, this generation will not pass away before all these things come to pass. And he's mentioned wars, famines, natural catastrophes, families splitting up, genocide of various kinds. And he's saying, this generation will not pass away until all these things come to pass. Now, to understand what Luke is writing in the year 90 AD. In the year 66 AD, which would have been about 30 years after Jesus had died, there was another Jewish rebellion against Roman occupation, beginning in 66 AD. And the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem, and the siege lasted for 4 years. And in the year 70 AD, the city was destroyed, and the temple was demolished, and it's never been built since. So Luke is mixing 4 different kinds of ends into this writing. He's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which happened 70 AD. He's talking about the end of the world, whenever that might happen. He's talking about individual death, and he's talking about the second coming of the Mashiach. And they're all mixed in together in this passage, and it's very difficult to try to unwind them and unpack them from each other. But when you're reading this literature, you have to keep that in mind. Luke, with 20 years of hindsight, is able to kind of predict the fall of Jerusalem, because it's already happened, with the resulting catastrophes for people, the bloodshed and the genocide that ensued because of it. But he's also talking about predicting the end of the world. And he's talking about individual demise. And he's talking about the coming of Jesus coming back again. And they're all mixed in together, which makes it very, very difficult to try to unwind this material and unpack this material. And then he makes this statement, he puts it into the mouth of Jesus, this generation will not pass away before all these things come to pass. So how come the end of the world hasn't happened 2,000 years after Jesus made the prediction? Now the truth is that in every single generation since Jesus and even before Jesus, that statement is true. This generation will not pass away before all these things come to be. Somewhere on planet Earth, every generation of human beings, someplace on planet Earth, has experienced all of these things. Catastrophes, warfare, genocide, famine, starvation. All of these things have been experienced in every single generation on planet Earth, somewhere on planet Earth. And if you just look at the trajectory, you look at our history, the history that we know at least. It happened in Sumeria, 3,800 years BC. It happened among the Akkadian, the great empire of Akkadia. It happened in the empire of Assyria. It happened in the empire of Babylon. It happened in the empire of Persia. It happened in the empire of Egypt. It happened in the empire of the Greeks. It happened in the empire of the Romans. It happened in the empire of the Portuguese. It happened in the empire of the Spaniards. It happened in the empire of the British, and it's happening now in the empire of the Americas. The same thing. People's lives being destroyed because of this kind of egoic needs of a little oligarchy to rule over the others. So Jesus is correct. Every generation has experienced it somewhere on planet Earth. No generation has passed without experiencing these kinds of things. So is this a dour message? It's not. Christ is talking about there is a solution to all of this. And he says, for instance, look at the trees. When you see the trees beginning to bud, you know that summer is near. And when you see all of these signs, you realize that the kingdom of heaven is near. And it's not that the kingdom of heaven is going to come in this cataclysmic event with Jesus riding on the clouds coming in glory and there being a television production all over the world simultaneously. That is not how it comes. It comes when the individual person or the individual community comes awake. And so that's my fourth point, coming awake and staying awake. When Gautama Siddhartha in the year 550 BC, who had begun his ministry of preaching enlightenment, the priests at the time were really, really upset with him. Gautama Siddhartha had no business in this, preaching business. He was a kshatriya. He belonged to the governor warrior caste of India. He was not a Brahmin. And the Brahmin were very, very, very upset with him. So they sent delegates to say to him, why are you preaching? You don't have permission to preach. Where's your license? Where's your ordination certificate? Are you a prophet? He says, no, I'm not a prophet. Are you a sage? I'm not a sage. Are you an angel? No, I'm not an angel. So who are you? And he said, I am Buddha, which just literally means I am awake. So the name Buddha was a nickname that he gave to himself. It's not his given name. His given name was Gautama Siddhartha. So what he was saying was, I am awake. And again and again and again, this is the message of Jesus Christ. Come awake. Throughout this passage today, several times he's talking about coming awake. He would say stuff like, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he would stay awake. So being awake is the essence. In fact, being awake is the mother of all the other virtues, including love. You cannot be a loving being if you're not awake. What looks like love, if you're not awake, is simply mawkish sentimentality. The very first virtue of all is being awake. And this is what Jesus is saying. You have to come awake, and you have to be awake. And it's not just an intellectual exercise of you exercising reason and logic. Wakefulness has to do with the heart as well. So he says, do not let your heart grow drowsy. Because the truth is, you can use a person's brain to overcome their heart. So often, we're inundated with all kinds of propaganda which are teaching our hearts to go hard. How else can you whip people up into paroxysms of anxiety and xenophobia and prejudice and genocide if you don't put their hearts to sleep? And very, very often, we're actually using their heads through propaganda to put their hearts to sleep. So Christ said, do not let your hearts grow drowsy. So it's a coming awake at an intuitive level. Coming awake through compassion and love and letting go of prejudices. This is the way forward. And there is a science to this as much as there is a science to life. Now, I've run this model by you a few times before. I wanted two models of science for me. The more extended model of science is this: how science operates. It doesn't matter what the discipline is, whether it's physics or it's geology, or psychology, whatever it is. Science operates in this following fashion. Firstly, there's a group of observations on the part of the scientist. Then there is some kind of a putative pattern that begins to emerge. The scientist begins to think, I think I see some kind of pattern in my data. Stage 2. Stage 3 is the scientist now creates a hypothesis to explain the putative pattern. I think this is the reason why this pattern is appearing. Now the fourth stage is I have to set up an experiment to test my hypothesis. If it proves to be true, I have to have some other scientist replicate it in her laboratory. If a bunch of scientists get the same result, we've now established a scientific principle. When we put a bunch of principles together, we have a scientific model of the discipline. Now at some stage, anomalous data are going to come in, and we're going to have to tweak our scientific model. And at some stages, so much anomalous data come in that we have to radically dismantle the old models and erect brand new models that can accommodate all the old data and all of the new data. And that happened twice in the 20th century, with relativity theory and with quantum mechanics, where the old Newtonian model was radically insufficient to explain all of the new data. So we had to create a model that could accommodate all the Newtonian stuff at a cosmic level, and at the microcosmic level, the quantum mechanical. Now that's one model of science. Or a simpler model of science is that there are 4 stages to it. There's the first stage is pattern recognition. We begin to recognize patterns, either weather patterns or historical patterns. So we begin to recognize patterns. The second stage is we start making inferences or interpretations of the patterns that we're witnessing. That's stage 2. Stage 3 is that allows us to make predictions. Because if you can establish patterns and make inferences, you can see where stuff is headed. If you're living in Israel at the time of Jesus and you hear Jesus is saying, when the wind is coming from the west, you say it's going to rain. Of course it is. Because if you live in Israel, if the wind is coming from the west, it's coming over the Mediterranean and it's taking water with it. And he says, if the wind is coming from the south, you say it's going to be really, really, really hot. And it is, because to the south of you is the Judean desert. So if the wind is coming from the Judean desert, it's going to be really, really hot. So now you're making predictions on the basis of the patterns and the inferences you've established. And the fourth part of it is now you have control. You can begin to control your environment because you know that there are causal connections between A and B. And therefore, if you understand that A causes B and you like B, keep doing A. If you don't like B, stop doing A. And that gives you control over it. Now, there has to be a science to spirituality, and Christ is pushing this again and again and again. We have to be able to establish patterns in our own spirituality. We have to be able to make inferences on the basis of the patterns we identify. We have to then be able to predict where it's headed, and then we have to take control of the process. If we don't like where it's headed, we have to make changes. And this is true for individual spirituality, it is true for the spirituality of a community, and it is true for the spirituality of the entire globe itself. And so waking up is the process of us making observations as a human community, looking at how our actions, what kinds of results our actions are creating. Genocides, destruction of the environment. When are we going to wake up to the realization that we have to start inferring, and interpreting those data and those patterns, and they alert us to the fact that we can easily predict where we're headed if we keep up this kind of stuff. And then we get the ability to try to control it by making changes at an individual level, at a community level, and as a global family of human beings, that this is the way forward. And so, but the good news is that the kingdom of heaven is not someplace in the sky. It's not going to happen with Jesus coming back in this extraordinary way. It's within you and among you. In Luke's gospel, again, Christ will use the phrase, the kingdom of God is en mesoi, a Greek term. En mesoi means it is within you and it is among you. So it's an intrapsychic phenomenon, and it's an interpersonal or cultural or community-wide phenomenon. The kingdom of God is nearer than the door back there. It's only a question of awakening to its reality and then acting accordingly. And when you wake up, you realize you have 3 missions. You have a mission to keep yourself awake. You have a mission to try to wake others up, and you have a mission to try to create a Christ consciousness for our globe.